and hello and welcome everyone to this session. Thanks for joining me in. So, as Ricardo mentioned, in this session, I will essentially be talking about some survey best research practices, especially if you're carrying out cross country surveys, and what are some things to keep in mind so that you get good quality data. So, before I begin, just a little background about myself. My name is Antarika Sen. I actually started out in academia. I did my PhD in cognitive psychology, where I worked on understanding how vocal emotion recognition changes with age. But after my journey in academia, I transitioned into the world of market research. I currently work as an associate research director in a data analytics and market research startup called Milieu Insight. We are headquartered in Singapore, but we carry out research across Southeast Asia. So we have a regional presence. And one thing I really enjoy doing at my work is to kind of experiment with research methodologies to see what are some best practice methods we can do so that you improve data collection and data analysis. And I strongly believe that the world of quant survey research has changed so drastically over the years, and we've moved away from traditional methods where we use telephone surveys or face to face interviews or even desktop surveys to primarily smartphone mobile based surveys. So I think it's really important that our methodologies and research analysis also keep pace with the changing world of market research. So the agenda for today is essentially, I'll first start off with an introduction to what I mean by cross-country surveys and how we do it in the world of market research. I know we have an audience from a diverse background, so just to lay an even playing field. Then I'll lay the context into the potential issues that you face with cross-country surveys. I'll then also touch upon some existing literature on cross-country surveys and how cultural differences can play into bias. And I'll also focus mainly on point number 4, that is some tips to keep in mind when you design and carry out cross country surveys. And these tips are drawn from my personal experience at work because I work with survey research a lot, and especially in cross country survey analysis. So, with that, let me dive into the main focus, which is how to do better cross country research. Now, cross country research and surveys are actually a really compelling avenue of research, which allows one to compare how people's opinions, attitudes, and behavior change across different cultures or even are similar across different cultures. So, for instance, for a brand, you can use cross country surveys to derive really meaningful insights on how your consumers are different or similar across different countries so that you can make strategic decisions accordingly. So, in the world of market research, if you're a brand and you kind of engage with a market research company to carry out cross-country research, it typically starts with designing your core survey. So you pack in all the questions that you want to ask to understand more about your consumers. Then you typically, once you've formed up your survey, you translate it to your local languages. You run the survey across the different markets, you analyze the data, and then you compare your results. Now, this is seemingly straightforward. However, there are inherent complexities and biases that can creep into each of these steps that can compromise how you compare your results. So, just to give you a typical example, a central to this issue of cross-country surveys is the survey instrument used itself. Now, in cross-country research, you often use Likert types rating scale. So you see an agreement scale or a likelihood scale. So just to throw in an example, say you're doing a really fun research where you're interested to see how people love dogs across different countries. You run a scale in Singapore. The primary language is typically English, and then you translate it into Indonesia. You run the same question with the same rating scale. And then you typically, what you do is you compare a mean score, or when you're doing a Likert scale, you derive a top 2 box. That means you add up the top 2 responses, and then you compare the scores across the 2 countries to see if there's significant differences. Now, I'm simplifying it, but this is typically what's done. However, a core issue is that this assumes people from different countries understand and use the scales in a similar manner. Now, the reality is that there are inherent cultural differences in the way people use rating scales. The meaning attached to strongly agree in Singapore could be very different from what strongly agree means in Indonesia. And this is a label scale. This issue compounds when you use a numerical scale where you have no labels attached. So there's even more variance. Now, a very good example is actually a famous study that was run in 2012. It was actually a poll conducted by Gallup in 2012. And what they wanted to know is they wanted to see how different countries compare in the happiness levels. So it was basically a yes or no rating scale. And what you see here on this graph is I've plotted the top 10 happy countries in yellow on top, and then you have a break, and then you have the least happy countries at the bottom, that's in blue. Now, this was across 148 countries, and there were two results that were startling or interesting that kind of made researchers think about it. One is that 8 out of the top 10 countries who displayed like the most positive emotions were belonging to Latin America. So, 8 out of the top 10 countries for positive emotions were from LATAM. However, a peculiar finding was that the least happy country, the absolute bottommost, rank 148, was Singapore. Now, this was interesting because Singapore has a really high GDP per capita. You have a really politically stable and culturally stable nation. Not to say that this by no means assumes happiness is only defined by these variables, but researchers kind of thought about the fact that is there a possibility that the differences aren't just reflective of the real happiness levels, but it could be a systematic difference in the response style of different cultures? So the research question is that is it really that Singapore is the least happy country, or is it that they are less likely to communicate positive emotions in a survey? Are Latin American countries actually the most happy, or are they more likely to resort to extreme responses? That means they're more likely to agree with something, or they're more likely to choose the highest rating. So there are some existing literature that kind of touch upon this. There's a very famous study by Harzing and her team in 2006, and there are a few other studies as well, where they have found that there are actually cultural clusters. So in this graph here, you see is that LATAM countries and Southern European markets are more likely to adopt a higher acquiescent style. That means they're more likely to agree with something. So in global satisfaction and loyalty and branding studies, they are countries that come out with the highest ratings. However, East Asian countries on the other end are show a stronger tendency to have a middling response, or they tend to kind of not agree with something but sit somewhere in the middle. And there is some reasoning behind this. So, in the study by Harzing and her team, they found that there are country level differences in characteristics such as power distance, collectivism, or how they have uncertainty avoidance, and they have a positive correlation with response styles. So, keeping this in mind, that you may see that countries are very different in the way they use rating scales and in the way they actually engage in surveys. What are some research best practices that you can keep in mind in order to minimize the bias? It's probably not possible to have 100% perfect condition, but what can, as researchers, can we do to minimize the bias? So, so the single most important thing that you need to do if you're carrying out cross-country surveys is to ensure that your survey is consistent across all markets. That means you have the same questions, same response scales. Now, in one of the client studies, we saw that they wanted to compare recommendation levels of a product across different markets. But the way the question was, even though the intention was the same to understand recommendation propensity, the way the question asked was different. It was a yes or no in one question in one country. It was a likelihood scale in another because they were very averse to NPS 11-point scale. And in a third market, the research team did a typical NPS rating. So this was a big no in terms of comparison, even though you may have derived score, because different scales introduce different inherent biases itself. So you're adding to the cross-country differences. So ensure that your questionnaire is absolutely the same in terms of the questions asked as well as the response options. Number two, even after you may have the same questions and the same response scale, one thing I've realized in my studies is that you need to ensure that your order of questions is also similar. So, what happens in market research sometimes is that before your core meat of the survey, say your survey is actually just 10 questions, you may preface it with some demographic questions. Now, these demographic questions and the number of them may vary depending on the country. So, your main questionnaire may actually start off in much later than another country because of the questions you preface it. In one of the experiments we ran, there was a question asked, have you seen this brand ad before? And depending on where the question was placed in the survey, the number of people who actually said yes, that we have seen this ad before in the in the same country and the same like-minded like demographic audience, we see that depending on the position of the survey, the response levels changed, because sometimes if a question, yes or no question, is at the top, you may have a higher propensity to say yes, because they fear it's a screening question, and if they don't say yes, they'll be disqualified. So this is just to go on to say that the order of question, varying orders can introduce order effects. So when you run cross-country surveys, the order of questions is very important, because what you see before a question can prime the way you answer, and also depending on where the question is placed, the psychology of the respondent may also change. Number three, again, and a really important point to ensure, is that the survey mode should be consistent. So there are cases where in certain markets, maybe you do a desktop survey, but in another market, it would be a mobile-based survey. Now, different methodologies, different different modes of surveys can introduce their own bias because of different user experience. So I think it's really important to ensure that the mode in which you administer the survey is also consistent across the market, so that you ensure that it's similar. However, if you have to have a hybrid mode, that means you want a mix of, say, desktop as well as smartphone, I think it would be a really good idea to ensure that the balance is similar, the proportions are similar across your different markets. Another thing that is really important to take note of is that different countries tend to display different levels of top choice bias. Now, what I mean by top choice bias is that the propensity to choose the absolute topmost answer, no matter what question you ask and no matter what scale you use. So, in an experiment that we ran, we actually ran the exact same survey across different varying scale lengths across 6 different markets. So, it was absolutely the same questions asked, same scale types, but different length of scales. And what we found is that, so in the markets that we analyzed, it was basically Southeast Asian countries: Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam. No matter what length of the scale we used, it emerged that Vietnam and Philippines had a greater propensity to choose the top choice, which was interesting, because no matter which question type, we played around with different types of topics, different types of scales, and no matter which scale type or topic, we see that Vietnam and Philippines use the highest rating on a scale, more likely to use the highest rating scale compared to other markets. So what this suggests is that irrespective of the question or the scale length, some countries just tend to be high raters. Now, it's a good idea to get a sense of what the response patterns are like for the markets you're serving, and whether if there are consistently high rating markets that you can account for while analyzing your data. We also realized that the design format of the scale matters. So, for instance, we played around with 2 different types of scales. On the left, you see a very standard, typical radio button single select scale. That's your typical standard single select scale that you would see on a mobile device. On the right, we played around with another spinner scale. So the spinner scale essentially, it is configured in a way that the default was to display the middle of the scale, and you would have to engage with the spinner scale in order to register your answer and proceed to the next question. So what we find is that what happens sometimes in standard single select scale, especially if it's a long if it's a long NPS 11-point scale, you have to keep scrolling down to kind of engage with it. But in a spinner scale, you do still have to scroll, but you can kind of interact with it a little more easily. What we noticed is that in the spinner design, you see a drop in the top choice bias in the 2 countries that we saw that displayed in our study, that was Vietnam and Philippines, that had a significantly higher amount of top choice bias. We see that this dropped when you use a spinner scale. So what does this mean for cross-country comparison? What it means is that the type of scale that you use can also introduce a bias, and the difference that you may see could be a research artifact rather than reflective of actual observed results. So in this case, the difference between your countries, say for example, Vietnam and Singapore, could actually be exaggerated due to a poor scale design, which could contribute to response bias. It's so the takeaway here is that it's important to optimize your scales for better user experience. So some studies have also found that using visual analog scales can reduce intercountry variance by almost a third. So visual formats are something like this. However, even though this may be good for desktop research, they may not be ideal for a smartphone user experience because of um, the limitations of the screen. So what you can do is maybe try and avoid using the standard radio button scales and explore alternative rating scales to see what best suits your mode of research. What's important to consider is that smartphone screens have limited real estate, so you need to make sure that your scales are optimized for that. So, in one of the previous points, I mentioned that it's important to note that some countries tend to be high raters. So, one way to combat this is to incorporate a mix of negative and positive statements. So, for instance, if your question is, to what extent do you agree with something? To what extent do you agree that product X is good? You can maybe flip around the question to see to what extent do you agree that product X is bad and have the same scale. So if you see inconsistent respondents, you can kind of weed them out of your data set so that you can ensure that you don't have respondents who consistently select the top choice. Another point that is underrated, it may seem very intuitive that yes, obviously translation matters, but in a market research agency, sometimes what happens is that you sometimes outsource your translations to a third party. You may not do that yourself, especially if it's across multiple different countries and you may not have in-house resources. So while that's logical and that makes sense, but it's really important to ensure that the translations kind of capture the little nuances in your questions and response options so that you don't introduce bias just because of poorly worded questions. So one thing that we do is sometimes, even though we may outsource the translations to a third party agency, we kind of vet the translations ourselves, and we also incorporate the thought process of our brands or the research owners who are actually running the survey to kind of ensure that the survey and the wordings capture the nuances and the little details that may kind of go amiss if someone who is not very well versed with the topic of the research can turn a blind eye to. So yeah, a highly underrated thing, ensure that your wordings and translations are really good. And last but not the least, I can't underscore how important it is to actually clean out potentially inattentive respondents. So, something that is often done is to introduce attention check questions so that you can catch respondents who may not be carefully considering their answers, who may be randomizing their responses. So, one example would also be like to catch straight liners. So, one of the examples I gave you is there are markets that consistently choose the top choice response no matter what scales you use, no matter what topic you research on. So one example would be to weed out those who select your top choice answers across all questions, and especially if you kind of if you mix your positive and negative questions around to catch those who may be selecting the top choice, this is a great way. So if someone selects strongly agree across all questions, no matter what's asked, that could help you reduce your bad respondents. The other thing we also found is that using a spinner scale on a smartphone rather than a standard radio button single select question reduces the chances of straight lining. So, especially in Philippines and Vietnam, we found that there are greater propensity for respondents to choose the topmost choice. This is higher in a standard scale versus a spinner scale, where you may kind of where it starts off at the neutral, and then you have to get the respondents to engage with the scale. So yeah, this is something I think you should definitely encounter for. And we've also noticed that different markets have different rates of bad respondents because, I don't know, incentives to do a survey may motivate respondents differently across different markets. So I think it's really important to have a mix of different sets of attention check questions to weed out bad respondents, just so that you have this another added layer that you remove in terms of bias across different countries. So that's the last best practice tip that I would like to offer. But at the end of it, I think one thing that, as a quant researcher that deals with survey research, one thing that we really need to think about and think about in a regular, reflective manner is, are we providing good user experience to our researchers? Because especially for an agent, for a researcher who works for an agency rather than in-house, we sometimes cater the survey questions more towards the brands rather than the users. So sometimes it's really important to slip into the shoes of a respondent to see what kind of a good user experience they are getting. So cannot highlight enough how poor survey design equals poor data, and the quality of the insights you get eventually is only as good as the survey design and the user experience. So we need to think about this deeply, and kind of, as I said, these conferences like this are a great place to kind of exchange our best practices with each other so that we can learn from each other and kind of iterate and improve our questionnaires. Last but not the least, I believe these slides are shared with everyone. I've just shared a few. If you want to learn more about the experiments that we have conducted, you can click on some of these articles which elaborate more on that. And yeah, I would love to connect with you all and open to questions. If I can't answer them right now, I'm happy to kind of engage with them in email or via LinkedIn. Yep, thanks so much.
All right. Thank you very much. Excellent presentation. And we have, yes, some questions here. For example, the first one from car person is, can we ever directly and validly compare means on scale questions between countries? I feel like I always have to compete with concerns of acquiescence bias.
You're absolutely right. I think this is a great question. That's why I think whenever I present on how to better cross country surveys, you will never find a perfect research setting where you can compare two countries apple to apple without any bias. So, as researchers, I think it's important to just take measures to minimize the bias as much as we can. I don't think there will ever be a perfect scenario where you can completely compare the two without any bias, but that's why, as researchers, there are multiple things to keep in mind to minimize the bias. And speaking about acquiescence bias, that's something I worry about a lot. That's why when cleaning out data sets, I look out for those who select strongly agree across multiple questions, no matter what they ask. You need to have manipulation checks so that you can, have contradictory questions and catch those who select strongly agree, no matter what question type you ask. So yeah, it involves a lot of like mindful exercises when you design your survey as well as analyze the data.
Great. Excellent. And Asha Campbell is asking, when you say highest, are you equating this to the most positive or just the top answer choice provided?
Yeah, that's a good question. I meant the top choice. It does not have to be positive. There's a tendency for some countries to choose the top answer no matter what the scale is. So it may be even negative on top. So it's not so much as they are more positive, but they just have a tendency. I would say that it's a poor survey taking behavior. Some of them may just be kind of speeding through, or they lose their motivation through the survey. So yeah, in my research, I found that there's a top choice bias, not really a positive bias. So that's something you need to be wary of.
Great. And another question here is about the spinner scale. When it's introducing the spinner scale, did you see a higher cluster of responses at the middle default option?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually. So we saw that the top choice reduces. So I was keen to see, okay, if there's a reduction of top choice, where what are they choosing, right? If not top, where else are they going? But we find that they're not actually deviating just to the middle. They are they are more likely to spread across middle and towards the top. So the answer to your question is no, they don't default to middle because the spinner defaults at the middle, but we didn't see that they are more likely to choose the middle option. We see that, okay, they are engaging and actually maybe giving a thought of where exactly they want to rate the question.
Right. And we have another question. If you have respondents using both web and mobile, is it possible to have a spinner scale on the web version through the usual platforms like Qualtrics and SurveyMonkey? Would that be an odd, clunky UX for web users?
Yeah, so I think the spinner scale was more for smartphone surveys. So it's more intuitive and it makes more sense for a smartphone. So that was a more mobile specific design. So I don't sometimes for really long responses, you do see spinner scale on desktop research. So for instance, if you have questions like, hey, what's your nationality? Sometimes you see spinner scales which default to certain countries. But yeah, I don't have the perfect answer for what the alternative could be for desktop research, but that's something worth exploring.
Right. And Teen is asking, there is some research for cross-cultural bias focusing on Western cultures versus Asian cultures, but even within European countries, I fear a lot of bias. For example, Spain versus France versus Germany. Any more resources or differences in responses within European countries?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, a lot of researchers tend to cluster different countries based on the broad region. So you typically have Western countries versus Europe or versus Southeast Asia. That's why one of the motivations of my study was Southeast Asia or East Asia is often clubbed together. But from my research, I find that even within Southeast Asian countries, there was so much difference between just Singapore and Vietnam and Philippines. So, and to your question, there do exist differences even with European countries. So Spanish. So I think in one of the slides I shared that Southern European countries tend to have a stronger acquiescence bias compared to Germany and certain other countries. So there are some really good literature out there that you can check out. That I think it's important to not just group countries together just based on their region, but yeah, it's worthwhile even examining cultural differences within a particular region.
Right. And is it country that is the main contributing factor or something smaller like culture? Is there a way to tell the difference?
Yeah, as I said, in one of the research, they found that LATAM countries and Southern European countries, because of similar cultural backgrounds, could be contributing to differences. So I don't think it's as specific as just countries. It's worthwhile to kind of put focus on cultural differences as well. I don't have a perfect answer to this, but yeah, it's worthwhile to check that.
Great. Excellent. So thank you very much, Antarika, for your excellent presentation for this very relevant topic. And we would like to say your last words before we finish.
No, thank you so much. It was great to be back again this year after the last year. And yeah, thanks so much, everyone, for your questions and the thoughtful comments.
Great. Thank you very much. See you soon.
Thank you.